We'll begin in just. I think this is a little quiet, but we'll begin in just a minute, everyone. So if you could find your seats, and there are a few seats remaining. I know that most people don't want to sit next to Dorian Speed for obvious reasons, but there is a seat. That's another way of saying the first shall be last, last shall be first, and everyone wants to sit next to Dorian Speed is another way of putting it. So, but come up to the front if you can. Dorian prayed the litany of humility this morning, and I'm the answer to her prayer. Let's begin with another prayer, and this one is copyrighted by Flannery O'Connor for plagiarism purposes. I just want to make sure I don't get in trouble. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am should or could see, but what I'm afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. I very much want to succeed in the world with what I want to do. I have prayed to you about this with my mind and my nerves on it, and have strung my nerves into a tension over it, and said, oh God, please, and I must, and please, please. I have not asked you, I feel, in the right way. Let me henceforth ask you with resignation, that not being or meant to be a slacking up in prayer, but a less frenzied kind, realizing that the frenzy is caused by an eagerness for what I want and not a spiritual trust. I do not wish to presume. I want to love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Dr. Joshua Hren, and I am the founder and editor of Wiseblood Books and also the co-founder of the MFA at the University of St. Thomas. And I am very much honored and overjoyed, in fact, to be able to introduce our panelists, who are all Wiseblood authors. Sally Thomas is a poet and fiction writer, author of two poetry collections, Motherland and The Forthcoming Among the Living, both from Able Muse Press. Her novel, Works of Mercy, was published in 2022 by Wiseblood, and a short story collection, The Blackbird and Other Stories, appeared from us in August of this year. With Micah Maddox, she co-edited an anthology, Christian Poetry in America Since 1940, which received Christianity Today's 2023 Book Award in Culture and the Arts. She has been the recipient of the J.F. Powers Prize for Short Fiction, 2 Editor's Choice Awards, multiple Pushcourt Prize nominations in poetry, and lots of compliments from her children that are forthcoming. Julia Yost is senior editor of First Things. She holds an MA in English from Yale and an MFA in fiction from Washington University in St. Louis. Her essays on literature and culture appear in First Things Compact in the New York Times. She lives in New York with her husband and 4 sons. And Glenn Arbery grew up in the small town South during the Civil Rights era. He attended the University of Georgia before taking his PhD at the University of Dallas. He is the author of Why Literature Matters and the novels Bearings and Distances and Gates of Eden, along with dozens of essays and hundreds of columns. He has edited collections on the genre of tragedy that are indebted or collecting Louise Cowan, the great teacher of the University of Dallas, the Southern Critics, and the Confessions of St. Augustine. He left out of his biography that he is the former president of Wyoming Catholic College. I think that is apparently just a minor accomplishment along the way, a detour while he was doing bigger things, which include finishing his 3rd novel in the trilogy, from which he will read today, Gates of Heaven. Thank you so much again, all of you, for being here. So today's panel is really meant to kind of feature what Wiseblood is about. And Wiseblood is about, we were 11 years old at this point, and from the beginning, we have sought to find redemption in uncanny places and people, articulate the complexities of faith and doubt in all of their incarnate complexity, to dare an unflinching gaze at human beings as political animals, and to do all of this entering into the suffering of humankind without forfeiting hope. And I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity at a conference that's largely devoted to conversing and criticizing literature in the best sense, to just simply absorb it, experience it, and delight in it. I will begin, just before I turn things over to Sally, with reading a little bit of my own fiction. This was the best place that it fit in the conference. And this is two short excerpts from a novel called Blue Walls Falling Down, my second novel, which was just published about a month ago, less than a month ago. And it follows a woman named Stella Tesknota. The name Tesknota is derived from nostos, nostalgia. And so she's a woman who is longing for home, trying to find home. Her fiance has just mysteriously broken off the engagement, disappeared without anyone knowing where he went or why. And she throws herself into a really tough South Chicago teaching assignment. There she meets Peter Clavier, who's a kind of activist who was working the funeral beat and tired of watching his uncles and friends die and going to funerals week after week. And so he moves into psychology. And he's a counselor at the school that she works at, St. Cabrini in South Chicago. And she convinces herself that she's feeling bad for him because none of the students are going into him. And she goes to visit with him. Obviously, she's also going to him because she's attracted to him and maybe in need of some help too. They fast fall into a tumultuous relationship. She gets pregnant. He swears off his political activity. But as you can see from today's excerpt, his swearing doesn't really mean that much. When Peter was running like mad for alderman, he led a whole block, 50-some people, down Bond Avenue on a sleepy Sunday night. He rallied the cussing, fussing neighbors, dispirited like a troop of the dead, to rise against the tragic accident, decrying the description of tragic death. He said, "It's a soporific. It's a prepared formula, like a pharmacy prescription to fool us into feeling finally or failing to feel, as it's a painkiller, failing to fail, as if nothing could have been done to prevent it." Hearing his tenacious tone, Stella kept her thoughts on tragedy to herself. Like a walking flash of lightning waiting to strike, Peter roused them from their lightless houses and sunken front porches. Throwing his arms out and pointing his fingers, twirling and twisting in every direction, he bid them build from the scraps of the accident a makeshift traffic circle, crying out, "We cannot wait for the state to do us justice. We cannot wait for Holy Mother State. We must scrape some semblance of justice from our wreckage like gleaners looking for silver lining in the gutters. If justice means starting with traffic circles made from trash, so be it. Amen." Little children and elderly men, middle-aged women with stoops in their steps, dragged out the overflowing garbage cans sanitation had started neglecting when walking the neighborhood became fatal. Even the evening before, after the unknown fool hit Miss Beatrice and ran his wheels at highway speed down the narrow, dark night street, the police had taken an hour to arrive. And by the time the ambulance came, the woman who had been walking home from the corner grocer's with a can of cooking oil had become, as Peter put it, a rigorous corpse, the commission of omission, the awful emblem of our condition. Peter's soles scraped against a board, a plank sharp-angled into the sky, and he pulled out the nails that threatened to puncture his rubber soles as he ascended. Balancing on a crossing of boards, discarded wood and a piece of the hood, a rearview mirror, he kicked lightly to the left where it crashed, shattered in the street. Though he fast recovered his tentative poise, stealing a smile and showing his teeth. The neighbors who had gathered tilted their heads as he stared down a Chevy headed straight for him. Half the street lamps blinked. Peter, arms akimbo, did not. The car played chicken but swerved, staring as if looking for that young man who'd gone to bed last night for the first time in his life, lacking a mother. Her as if always there, snoring, filling the dark room down the hall, lacking the cornmeal chicken she was planning for Sunday brunch after church, lacking her laughter and her temper as she threw, as she was known to, a pot or two at his head when he came home after curfew. Stella followed his eyes and found the boy's shadow cast across Miss Beatrice's big porch. The blue boards Peter had helped paint, lit by a security light. Peter climbed the pole the hit and run had ricocheted into, the propped-up, decapitated stop sign, the sign the pastor had dragged to the center and squeezed between stuffed green trash cans. Suspended there, like a crazed crossing guard, he held his arms out scarecrow fashion, halting traffic with a resigned stare that scared some of the kids to the sidelines, a stare that looked quite close to despair, but which, she knew, was not his blues, but rather the strange sleep of his face, which had his will when he steeled it, when he stole in human strength as if from nothing. Satisfied, shaking hands, brushing bits of trash from their bodies, the crowd dissipated into the night. Peter stood there, unmoved, stubborn, staring through the passing car's headlights, beyond his eyes blinking against the stellar light shed from impossible distances that existed, not infinite in fact, but feigning a level of measure that defied the mind. The spaces between the cars and the stars, the distance uncrossed by any man. His gaze widened, eerily bold, refusing to blink at what we had made, at what it had come to, the spaces between the stars and the cars. His vision narrowed until the stare she saw there scared her, for it came from someone beyond recognition. A host of fury who fought the world single-handed in the Chicago night, valiant amidst so much violence, but unable to save himself. His crossing guard arms stretched all the way out, as if to say, "Take me, here I am, take me," until she risked traffic and ran right to him and pulled at his pant leg, pleading with Peter to please come down, come home. He refused to look down. He did not come home. She had walked alone to that place she called home, a stranger in someone else's kitchen, doing dishes with the watered-down detergent, the garish blue neon sinking to the bottom and exploding suds from the scalding water. Her fingers scrubbing from the week-old dishes, a desperate effort to domesticate the untallied distance that hid her from him. Wringing filthy refuse from the sponge, burnt bread crusts forgotten in the toaster, set afire until Peter blew it out, turned into infinitesimal crumbs. She was not rid of her soaked-up anger. As she watched her furrowed face in the water, a flash of sweat wetted her forehead, and she grasped, frantic, the kitchen garbage, throwing up her insides until only bile and then only nothing could be retched from her hurting bowels. From miles of convoluted intestines, emptied and throbbing, all the miles she had walked with him, the soles of her feet itching and hot, and then a fevered forehead burning her memories until what she'd done was a welcome blur, as if it could not define her future. She let out a sequence of staccato screams, felt the swell of the fledgling baby whose father she sensed could be dead any day. With a wet dish towel tossed over her shoulder, she took the garbage out to rusted green wastebin. Like the dutiful spouse, she could no longer play. Okay, now this next excerpt is from, it's a childhood memory of a character who's the protagonist of my first novel, Infinite Regress. His name is Blake Yorick, and he's the fiancé who disappeared, who then reappears later on in Blue Walls Falling Down. And this is one of his childhood memories. It's also an image that serves as a kind of bridge between the two novels that are part of a trilogy called The Accidental Family. I'm working on the third novel now. It's called The Hotel Dieu. As a child at home, he had watched his mother from the ledge of a staircase that regressed upwards, eternally rising like a corkscrew bent on piercing the well-guarded gates of Eden. And he saw somehow his mother, Catherine, stretched across a number of days, across even years at once, like in camera clips at high speed, blurred into a perpetual present, tending to too many things all day, receipts and doctor's bills, till she went gray. She could not even scrounge the duration required for her hand to open the drawer and retrieve the ragged hot pads that hardly worked anymore. And so she started searing the table with the dinner pans, mostly, at first, in the same spaces, but over time she singed the varnished top with a purpose, turning the center a kind of creamy, milky white that looked lovely against the deep brown wood. Slowly, with Penelope's shrewdness and patience, she expanded the singes in secret until once, when Dad returned from a very long shift and she could see through his soured eyes that his mind wore suicide like a familiar beaten Milwaukee baseball cap, she removed the bills that typically covered the table even at dinner. Unable to tame the wild smile that stole across her mouth, squatting over the chair because she could not sit upon it, Catherine removed the unpaid bills that had kept her secret unseen. She unveiled the pattern that years of searing had given shape. No one ate for a long time. Each of them wrapped there over the rose window S-shapes that kissed to form at once flames and teardrops and drips of blood transfused, translucent as though overflowing, flowing out from the cleansing core, symmetrical and the same, but as if alive and bent on burning beyond their confines, even as they could never escape the petals of the rose that contained them. And for once, the perpetual agitated buffeting and shuffling of Mom and Dad ceased, as did all well-intentioned jabs under the table between siblings. All the world at peace. Sheepish, Catherine said that the searings were amateur for sure, showed only the blinded outer eye of the brilliant rose window at Chartres Cathedral. Sublimely dulled, she said, of the colors that come when you enter the church and kneel there in Chartres. Temples throbbing as you look at your hands covered with the color of blood red pouring, raining down from the dyed shards, lit bright by the dying sun. Lyrical nonsense, sure, she granted, but no laughs or criticism could touch her, as that is how she saw it still, or how it saw her even from afar. An eye widening and widening in the light, no longer admiring the intricacies of the exterior, but captured by the tongues of flames and by the drops of blood and by the massive tears that shoot out from the center of the rose, which is the center. I can hardly say it, she said, of the cosmos. Don't laugh, just trust me. I see him, Christ himself, at the center of the cosmos. And Blake's father, lost in her eyes, nearly knelt down at Catherine's side as he kissed her very lightly on the mouth. So, Sally, take it away.
Well, thank you, Joshua, and thank you all for being here. It's amazing to look out at a standing room only crowd. This is incredible. So thank you. I'm going to read today from my new book of short stories, The Blackbird and Other Stories. Take a minute to admire the blackbird on the cover. It's a woodcut by my youngest daughter. Very proud of that. I hope she's very proud of that.
The commission was steep, though.
Yeah, right. The story that I'm going to read from today is called A Fire in the Hills. It occurs fairly late in the collection, and it's one of two stories set not in the American South, which is where I'm from, but in Salt Lake City, Utah, where my husband and I, and eventually our first two children, lived for 8 years in the 1990s. We went there for me to go to grad school and ended up staying a lot longer than we thought we were going to. And as much as the people and the landscapes and the culture of the South really come to bear on my imagination, the whole time I lived in Utah, I was completely captivated by that, to me, extremely alien landscape, and also just the culture that you're moving around in that has its own distinctive character. And I say that particularly because this story engages with that culture a little bit. I don't want to give a whole lot of exposition except to say that the story is in excerpts anyway. It's in little sections that move around in time. So hopefully, I've never read it aloud before, so I hope it's going to excerpt pretty well. I think most things about it will quickly become self-explanatory. I think I'm going to skirt around, actually, the central catastrophe of the story, which actually the narrator skirts around completely during the course of the story, although, of course, you, the reader, sort of figure out what it is. And this story is kind of strange, I guess, in the sense that its protagonist, unlike the classical conception of the protagonist, actually doesn't seem to have learned. She's as delusional at the end of the story as she is at the beginning, but hopefully we have some insight about how Grace is working on her, even though she is trying very hard to deny the very existence of Grace. But I think she's going to tell you everything else about her that you need to know. So this is A Fire in the Hills. Really, I have no complaints. I love my husband. Our life is good. Our little house high up in the avenues, which is a neighborhood in downtown Salt Lake. Our little house high up in the avenues suits us perfectly. Nice kitchen, spare room for Declan's study, built-in bookshelves in every room. We live there comfortably, Declan and I. Every week or so, his 3 grown sons join us for dinner. The easiest offspring, I have found, are the ones you inherit as adults. They come to your house, they drink your wine, sometimes they bring you wine. They engage in polite conversation. When they've gone, you sit on the couch with your sweetheart before the open window through which the city lights below you, a great grid narrowing to a point at the south end of the Salt Lake Valley, shiver in the restless summer night. You tuck your bare feet beneath you. You drink a good night glass together, and you are happy. I, that is, am happy. Every summer, some dry part of the mountains is burning. Potentially, I suppose, it could all burn right up. Potentially, the flames could come down and swallow us too, but so far it hasn't happened. Most of the time, the fires are nowhere near us, but at night, when darkness descends, it all strikes closer. You'd think it was your neighbor's house, or maybe even your own, starting to smolder. Your husband gets up dutifully and goes around feeling walls and floors, smelling everywhere to calm you down. The smoke alarms are working, Vinny, he says to reassure you. If you're me, that is, and Lavinia is your name. If there were really anything wrong, they'd go off. Everything's fine. It's just a wildfire somewhere, far away. Go back to sleep. I, lie back down. The nightmare you've been having is over. Chances are that it won't ambush you a second time. The house is flooded with moonlight and quiet. Declan gets back into bed and turns so that I can lie spoonwise with him, my cheek on his cool shoulder blade. The peace is blessed and unbroken. There's no storm, no lightning, no flood, no telephone call, nothing to shatter the night. When your love's made sure, you can go to sleep. If sometimes I see Bernard, it's by accident. I know people who maintain friendships with exes, but I'm not one of them. Until I met Declan, I was a bridge burner. In high school, I would like a boy for precisely as long as it took him to call me his girlfriend, and in my 20s, I wasn't much better. When Bernard and I parted, we did not part as friends. But I can't help seeing him sometimes. Declan and I hold season tickets to the Wind Chamber Ensemble. The music, by contemporary and experimental composers is excellent. It's not a personal thing. We go in spite of Bernard, not because of him. Anyway, that kind of seeing only partly counts. It's only me seeing him from a distance in the dark when he doesn't know I'm there. Most of the time, I see his back, arms upraised to the expectant musicians. The stage lights shine on his long black hair. I used to run my hands through that hair, but this seems impossible to me now. When I first moved here as a student, knowing no one, I constantly mistook strangers for people I knew. People from back home, maybe, or from college, people whose names hung on the tip of my tongue, just out of reach. More than once, before my vision cleared, I almost cried out in surprise and delight. Sometimes people glanced at me oddly, reading the inexplicable recognition in my face. Seeing Bernard these days, I have the opposite sensation. Once upon a time, I knew him. I knew him in the biblical sense, for which intimacy is only another euphemism. Watching him on stage, however, I behold a stranger. That I once made a life with this person. Did I hallucinate the whole thing? Am I hallucinating now? Occasionally, Declan and I will attend some arts function, a fundraising dinner, a silent auction. I'll glimpse Bernard in the crowd, and he'll glimpse me. Our eyes will meet for an instant until one of us decides to pretend not to recognize the other. Of course, just as I've got Declan, Bernard has a wife. I still remember the first time I saw her at a children's cancer benefit some years ago. In all that pressing intermission crowd, she stood with Bernard, her hand in his. She was small, silver blonde, wearing red lipstick, a severe black dress, funky Mary Jane-style heels. I observed all these details with fascination. I took in also that she was pregnant. The black dress fit the swell of her body like a boast. There is a technique I use with clients in my counseling practice as a way of rewiring how the brain reads its contents. An abused woman, for example, may remember the first terrifying moment when her husband's face changed, when a stranger stepped into that familiar body and raised his hand to strike her. She may despise herself. Almost certainly she despises herself for having submitted to that blow. What I have her do, in the safety and comfort of my office, is call up that moment in her mind, place herself in it again. I take her back to herself as she was right then, not as she thinks she should have been. Doubtless she has been tormenting herself, what she ought to have said and done, either to defy him or to escape him or to keep him from wanting to hit her in the first place. She is certain that whatever has happened, it's her fault, and she deserves whatever suffering has come to her in consequence. No one, she thinks, can ever love her or forgive her. It's my job to prove her wrong. I take her back to that moment, that woman who sobs or cowers, and I invite her to forgive that woman and love her. Only thus can she set herself free. Of course, it's a process. I don't claim to be some kind of psychological miracle healer, only a wielder of tools. Because I wield them for myself, too. I know how limited they are, how long things take, but I'm good at it nonetheless. So I'm going to move forward just a little bit. She's given you enough background about herself. So we're going to shift back in time a little. That summer, I shared an apartment with Bernard in an old building downtown. Beautiful dark millwork, original Art Deco bathroom tile in yellow, mint green, and black. Our decorating, sadly, didn't do the place justice. In our life vision, this apartment occupied the level of the purely functional. That is to say, we had a relationship, or as the kids say today, a situation. We lived together, but where we lived together wasn't a home. Bernard's piano filled what would have been the dining room. Without the piano, we might have lived upstairs and had a view. By the window, looking into an overgrown foundation planting of junipers, I'd set a green plastic patio table, salvaged from the curb, to hold my books and papers in their disarray. In one bedroom stood our bed, a confusion of stale sheets on a Hollywood frame. The second bedroom was empty. We had talked about making it an office for me. In the narrow kitchen, the textured gold linoleum caught grime and kept it forever. Outside, the sun shone in its hard-edged way, though it never quite penetrated the junipers. The August heat wavered whitely on the sidewalks. The building itself was a world of sorts, with familiar rhythms that marked the progress of its day. Because I was home most of the time, writing up my research, I was able to mark this progress. My own consciousness began to be shaped by the bang of the foyer door, for example, right outside our own front door, and the rattling that meant the mailman. It was a daily noise, the background to my dissertation notes, but it was also always an instant of interest and diversion. The mailboxes, a bank of brass-fronted pigeonholes in the wall beneath the stairs, provided the one locus of community in our building, though it was a community more of evidence than of interaction. Just above us lived a group of LDS girl missionaries. How many there were, and whether they were always the same girls or different ones who moved in and out, I was never sure. They wore black skirts, white blouses, name tags. They all worked as tour guides at Temple Square. In the mornings, I heard them on the stairs, clattering and laughing, calling each other sister like a bunch of religious postulants. By the letters they clipped to the front of their mailbox to be collected, I knew that one of them was dating an elder Chad Sorensen on a mission in Ecuador. All of them, in fact, seemed to be dating missionaries scattered across the world. Clearly, they awaited that bright morning when those missionaries would return and they themselves could hang up their name tags and put on wedding dresses. They wrote every day, I thought, to make sure the men on the other end remembered all that. Bernard was scathing on the subject of the missionary girls. That's exactly what I got the hell out of, Vinny. 2 years in Bora Bora with a bicycle and some other twerp in a tie, asking strangers if they want to talk about family. Yeah, no thanks. And there's nothing cute about those girls. They're just pathetic. I can't imagine why you'd even be curious about them. I'm not curious about them, I said. I just think it's interesting what you can infer about people's lives. Some people's lives aren't worth inferring anything about. I don't mean to paint Bernard as an ass. He wasn't. That is to say, even when we're not casting off the shackles of our parents' religion, we're all like that in our 20s. Our own lives rivet us completely. Declan says that if I'd met him at any time before the age of 35, I'd have hated him. And I know myself well enough. I wasn't interested in those girls as people. I was interested in them as foils. I couldn't help thinking that there, but for the grace of whatever, went I. If I rummage around in the past, there's much to bring up that seems, on the face of it, inconsequential. What do I do with these shards of detail? What do I make of Miss Genevieve Macbeth, for example, who lived at the top of the building? She and I were the only people home all day, and we both listened for the mailman. Though she was in her 80s, Miss Macbeth could hear a dropped circular rustle to the floor 5 stories down and could be there to pick it up almost before it settled. We ran into each other often outside my door. Miss Macbeth had occupied her apartment, she had told me, since 1949, when she had come up from Manti, which is a town in Utah, to work in the ZCMI department store, and ZCMI stands for Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institute. And that's a big chain of department stores in Utah. To work in the ZCMI department store. Her perfectly good stove was the same one she had had when she moved in. In the beginning, she had made, and forever after had kept, a resolution to use it only on Sundays, to preserve it in excellent working order, like new, she said. In those days, the apartments had come fully furnished, with silverware and linens even. She still possessed 2 blankets from those lost days of luxury. Whether she still had the furniture and silverware too, or what had happened to it if she didn't, I never found out. Here are details. Miss Macbeth turns from the mailboxes. As always, her hair has been shellacked into a kind of double fold on top of her head, with a precise little snail shell curl at each temple. Beneath her black cat-eye spectacles, her long nose and tiny drawn-in mouth make her look like some exacting species of bird. She sees me wavering in my doorway, still dressed in the t-shirt and pajama trousers I've been wearing for days. "Are you all right?" she asks abruptly. "I'm okay, thanks. I've been kind of sick, but I'm better now." "Well," a quick bird-like movement of the head, "I hope that husband of yours has been taking care of you." She pronounces the word husband as if it meant something like drain clog or dog vomit. Miss Macbeth is an innocent. As usual, I let husband pass without comment. Generally, when Miss Macbeth mentions my husband, it's to complain about his piano. Even at times when he isn't physically present, she hears it. If I must have such an appendage as a husband, which of course I do not, then hopefully, she seems to imply, I get something out of the arrangement besides earworms. "Oh, he's always good to me," I murmur. "Well," she looks at me again, long and piercingly. Then she's gone up the stairs. It's a kind of friendliness we have. It pleases me far more than my few exchanges with the missionary girls, though you'd think we had much in common. "Hi," they call, bouncing past me and out the door, turning to each other as if for protection against this unwashed woman living in sin who has stepped out braless in her boyfriend's t-shirt to fetch the newspaper. "Sister, did you check the mail? Well, later then, we have to hurry." Always the missionary girls were cheerful in an impervious way that you wouldn't mistake for a desire to get to know you. Maybe Bernard was right and they weren't cute. I still see girls like that downtown, clustered at the stoplight, waiting to cross over to Temple Square. I know exactly how they sound, those hard, bright voices that chip away at the air. Miss Macbeth, I reflect, was the elderly version of those girls, the one whose missionary never came back, or did come back, but married someone else, or simply wasn't. If he ever existed, I didn't hear about him. If Miss Macbeth had hoped for anything besides perpetual blankets and kitchen drawers pre-filled with cutlery, she never told me. The friendliness we shared didn't penetrate that deep. Still, the part of me that thought about her at all wanted her not to have had the missionary or the hopes. How much less dreary it was to have meant to live alone. How am I on time? Can I keep going? No, I'm done. I thought I was done. Okay, well, that's a good place to end. How much less dreary it was to have meant to live alone. Thank you very much.
How's the microphone for me? I'm so short, I always worry about microphones. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Sally. That was tons of fun. I'm going to effect a hard shift from contemporary literature to the old stuff. So Joshua had asked me to write an entry in Wiseblood's very fine monograph series. He asked me to write a long essay on the dark side of Jane Austen. And so the result is Jane Austen's Darkness. I was very happy to do it. It was tons of fun. And this morning I'll be mixing my remarks pretty liberally with reading in order to give a sense of what my project is in this book. So in the book I cover all of Austen's novels and offer a dark thought about each one. But right now I'll be limiting myself to two. And I'll begin with Northanger Abbey, which is Austen's earliest completed novel, give or take some revisions toward the end of her life. And it contains a passage that I regard as very central to Austen's vision as a novelist. So Catherine, our heroine, has been reading too many Gothic novels, and she persuades herself that the patriarch of the family she's staying with is a Gothic tyrant who murdered his wife. And she confesses this suspicion to the man's son, whom she has a big crush on. And the son is very shocked, and he scolds her in this resonant passage. He says, "Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this? where roads and newspapers lay everything open. So this young man is saying, dark things don't happen here. This is the civilized world. People speak English. Everyone's normal and polite. Everything is as meets the eye. And Catherine is very embarrassed. Gosh, what was I right? What was he thinking? What was I thinking? He must be so right. But soon enough, and this is my summary. Soon enough, the old man, who had credited a rumor that Catherine was an heiress, learns through the same channels that she's merely the daughter of a clergyman. No longer desiring her as a daughter-in-law, he turns her out of his house and denies her even his carriage, so that she must find her own way home, a situation almost as perilous for a young lady as it is insulting. So Catherine at this point thinks, okay, so he didn't murder his wife. He's a totally respectable member of a society that places high value on money and connections, and he acts the part. So isn't he, in fact, a tyrant? And she begins to take Gothic literature seriously, not literally. And so this is me again. Gothic horror is a metaphor for English life. Social conventions mystify the operations of power and greed and cruelty, and meritorious persons are not wrong to cultivate a little paranoia. This moral is a bit schematic and a sign of the author's youth, but it helpfully exposes a premise of Austen's mature novels. The social world is darker than it looks. So in all of Austen's novels, I find society belongs mostly to the mediocre, the foolish, the snobbish, the greedy, and the cruel. And the need and desire of the few meritorious people is to get away and establish a more select society through marriage and a new family circle. Austen's heroines and heroes succeed at this to greater and lesser degrees, and the degree varies with how meritorious they are and their spouses are, and just with their susceptibility to social and natural evils. So that's the basic argument. I thought I would retrace my steps a little and give a sense of why I thought that a book on the dark side of Jane Austen would be useful. So a concrete example. The feature film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, starring Keira Knightley, came out in 2005. And I'm old enough that I viewed it with interest during its theatrical run. And the film has some charms, and it has some defects. And one of the things that bothered me was its presentation of Mrs. Bennet, our heroine's mother, who appears in earlier screen adaptations as just a bad mother, foolish woman, comically obsessed with getting her daughters married off to men with money, or just any men at all. But the 2005 film presents Mrs. Bennet as preoccupied with all of that, yes, but fundamentally a rational and loving mother. And in particular, there's one scene of cozy pillow talk between her and her husband that suggests a kind of basic respect and confidence subsisting between them. And so in 2005, I noticed that many film critics and a lot of my peers were really welcoming this humanizing take on Mrs. Bennet. Oh, no longer a caricature, Mrs. Bennet finally getting her due, or whatever. And I was studying English at Yale, so I was not surrounded by naive readers, but I thought, no. Jane Austen did not draw a fully human portrait of Mrs. Bennet. She drew a caricature. She's capable of both, and she chose caricature for Mrs. Bennet. Why did she do that? D.W. Harding, who is for me one of the most important commentators on Austen, has this take. He says, the technique of caricature allows Jane Austen to express what a person of her acute insight must always feel, astonishment at the way the most outrageously deformed personalities are allowed a part in society. So when Austen draws a caricature, what she's saying is, people are outrageous, and we generally let them camouflage because it's too painful or too costly to see them and call them out for what they are. But I am going to paint in really bright colors so that for once you have to see what is actually going on here. And so to try to soften that picture, I think, is really untrue to her art and her ethics. We should laugh at Mrs. Bennet. We should also condemn her. She's a bad mother to her daughters. She's a terrible match for her husband. Austen tells us that Mr. Bennet figured out early on that he had married an idiot, and at that point, quote, respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown, which is dark. So he's totally demoralized, and for years he lives in his library and more relishes than deplores the carryings on of his idiotic wife and such of their daughters as he can call silly and ignorant. His patter is disturbingly funny, especially in his double act with Mrs. Bennet, whom he takes delight in baiting. His constant theme is that the world is full of fools. His philosophy is stoical or cynical. For what do we live but to make sport for our neighbors and laugh at them in our turn? With his dark wit, he is an exponent of Austenian hatred in its purest form. So at a critical moment, of course, Mr. Bennet warns his daughter, Elizabeth, against making his mistake. He's concerned that she doesn't actually respect Darcy and is just marrying him for his money. And he tells her, if you marry the wrong person, it will destroy you. He says, you could hardly escape discredit and misery. He's wrong about Darcy, but he is right to say that marriage makes some people miserable, worse off than they would have been alone. Those are the stakes of Elizabeth's decision. So if you read Pride and Prejudice as a novel in which everybody's good enough and everybody's wise enough and everybody ends up happy, or there's some natural relation between marriage and happiness, you're not reading Austen. Like, Austen's world is full of natural and social evils, and there's no surefire remedy for them, certainly not marriage. I'm indebted to D.W. Harding, the critic I mentioned earlier, for my pessimism. His seminal essay, Regulated Hatred, an Aspect of the Work of Jane Austen, appeared in 1940. And Harding was a war psychologist who thought that people were evil and stupid and a danger to one another. He leans into psychobiography and presents Austen as this superior person who was stuck in the very humble role of poor gentry spinster. And he thinks that she was just full of hatred for the people around her who were so mediocre. But she had to regulate it because she depended on them for her survival. She was above her company, but literally could not afford to show it. And the same is more or less true for all of her heroines, until that is, and this is where Mr. Darcy comes in. I totally buy the romance of Pride and Prejudice. My dark thought here is simply that Mr. Darcy is never wrong. He thinks that everyone he meets is beneath him. He's actually right about that. The one time he's wrong, he swipes left on Elizabeth in a ballroom. He recants very swiftly, and he pays in blood. But everything else he gets exactly right. Everybody he scorns deserves it. So I write, and this is my long excerpt. Okay. Nor is it the case that Darcy is rude to the lowly. At least he's no less rude to the lofty, and Austen is far from polite to his victims, for they are people she hates. They range in status from Sir William Lucas of Lucas Lodge, an empty-headed knight whose fawning question about St. James's provokes Darcy to hint at a contempt for courtiership, up to his own titled aunt, whom he alienates for her insolence to his bride. According to his housekeeper, he is gracious to servants. His rudeness to Caroline Bingley, freely confessing his desire for one woman to another who openly desires him, verges on cruelty. Elizabeth later commends his sentiments. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for your approbation alone. In your heart, you thoroughly despised the persons who so assiduously courted you. We laugh at Miss Bingley's injuries because she is a snob who seeks to appropriate Darcy's prestige. His hatred of her is exquisitely regulated. He's almost pedantic in expounding for her his admiration of Elizabeth's eyes, and we share it. Darcy can afford to disdain the feelings of others, low and high. The dependent spinster, like Austen, could only dream of doing so. Darcy speaks and does as he wishes, comes and goes as he pleases. 50 miles of good road is for him a very easy distance, an opinion that exasperates Elizabeth, for she has just endured those 50 miles between Meryton and Hunsford, confined in a carriage with that same Sir William in his Tales of St. James's, to which she listens with about as much delight as to the rattle of the chaise, because she cannot otherwise afford to visit her friend Charlotte. Darcy's mobility allows him to depart any society he finds confined. Reading Harding's Regulated Hatred, we might ask how Austen would have behaved had she not needed to cultivate rich relatives in order to survive, had she not needed to get along with whatever society was around wherever the Austen ladies were being accommodated. She might have behaved much as Darcy does. After their engagement, it transpires that Darcy and Elizabeth are of one mind concerning which of her Meryton connections they can interact with without mortification, and Elizabeth can hardly wait to escape these people and constitute a new family party at Pemberley. This is one factor in the swiftness and completeness of Darcy's redemption. His hauteur is everybody's social revenge fantasy. So I go on to emphasize how Pemberley at the end of the novel offers the newlyweds not an escape from society, that would not be a properly happy ending, and I do think this is a novel that does have a happy ending, but a means of sifting and disciplining their circle. So the people they love and think well of, they welcome unconditionally, the Bingleys, the Gardners. People they neither love nor think well of are banished, that's Wickham. People they love but don't think so well of are welcome on certain conditions. So Lady Catherine comes crawling, Miss Bingley starts being super nice to Elizabeth, and Lydia can visit, but not with her husband. And the key, of course, is Pemberley. The final chapter, I was really struck by this in revisiting the novel, the final chapter really stresses that everybody wants to visit Pemberley, and that's what gives the Darcys leverage and allows them to dictate terms. So it's a perfect ending for the Darcys, because they can have commerce with the world and even with the fools in it without actually enduring the foolishness. But Austen makes very clear how expensive this solution is. It requires not just $10,000 a year, which is Darcy's famous income, but the very particular estate that produces and is sustained by that 10,000. It's a house and grounds that are the work of generations, as Darcy says, that are actually priceless. The Bingleys have already said that they just despair of purchasing or even imitating Pemberley. And it's Pemberley that allows the Darcys to be perfectly happy. So the dark side of their happy ending is that it really is 1 in a million. The situation for every other Austen heroine, as for all of us, is that if you marry the person who's right for you, you establish for yourself a better society in a small way, but you still have to have commerce with the wider society, and mostly not on your terms. We cannot go to Pemberley. In the worst case, we have to retreat to our libraries, like Mr. Bennet, although unlike him, we can at least read Jane Austen novels. Thank you.
We'll end with Gwen.
Thank you. So I'm going to be reading an excerpt this morning from my new novel, Gates of Heaven, which is my third one with Wiseblood. Thank you, Joshua. This one is set in the COVID year, 2020, just before and just after the election, and it follows 3 characters from my previous novels. When Jacob Guizak's school shuts down again for the latest outbreak of COVID, Jacob's father sets him up remotely with his friend Braxton Forrest, who's a retired professor, and who assigns Jacob a 100-page paper on William Tecumseh Sherman to be finished in the 5 weeks before the election, which is exactly the kind of thing that Forrest would do. For his part, Forrest's daughter in Atlanta is having major difficulties in her marriage, which eventually pulls Forrest and Jacob with him toward Atlanta to address the situation. Meanwhile, Jacob's father, Carl Guizak, a once promising poet who now runs a Wyoming political website funded by Forrest, comes down with a major case of COVID, much to his embarrassment, on election day, when he's life-flighted to Salt Lake City, of all places, and put in an induced coma for almost 2 months, taking his son's project on Sherman with him into a series of dreams in which he has to save Sherman's soul in order to get into heaven himself. The question of Sherman runs through the whole novel in various ways, most of them centered on what Jacob Guizak writes in a series of fictions from Sherman's point of view. The Catholic part of Sherman, you might not know, is that he was taken into a foster family when his father died. They were very Catholic, especially his foster mother. Sherman grew up in that household, steadfastly rejecting the Catholic faith, then married his foster sister, I won't get too much, who was also devoutly Catholic. His father-in-law, Thomas Ewing, had been a senator and a cabinet member, so they were a very prominent Catholic family. So what I'm going to be reading this morning is kind of a fiction within the fiction. This is Jacob Guizak's piece on Sherman as he's approaching Atlanta from the north in 1864. Atlanta wasn't taken until September of that year, so this is a kind of hiatus just north of Kennesaw Mountain, which was a major battle that Sherman lost decisively because it was a frontal assault. But some of this, I think, will emerge from what I'm reading. It rained for the first half of June, a steady, drenching rain that turned every road to red mud and made the soldiers curse the war in the South and especially Joe Johnston's Confederates. The rebels had retreated steadily through the woods and gullies, never on the run. Johnston had prepared defensive positions all the way back to Atlanta. His men could dig a trench and get inside it like those little clams on the beach that could disappear under the sand while you looked at them. Whenever Sherman found a dry spot to stand, sometimes on a porch, sometimes in a depot, he gathered his officers to plan their next movement. His maps and papers clung together, moldy as grave clothes. On and on it rained. The men hunkered down miserably. The disconsolate horses hung their heads. The cooking fires sputtered on wet wood. The mess tents filled with smoke. The muddy red creeks and rivers rose. Sherman felt his melancholy returning. It was the worst since Memphis when Willie died. This was his 10-year-old son. During the days he rode as the rain pounded down, water streaming from his hat and his greatcoat as he checked the lines, urging on the soldiers. Johnston's 60,000 men, spread thin across a 10-mile front, occupied fortified lines on the last ridges between the Union Army and the Chattahoochee River. Sherman remembered the terrain from his weekend explorations 20 years before. From the heights of Kennesaw and Pine Mountain, the Rebs could see every Union movement and anticipate the flanking maneuvers that had kept them moving backward all the way down from Chattanooga without a decisive battle. He was so exhausted, he knew he would soon begin to make mistakes that he could not afford. His temper flared up easily. Another sleepless night in the tent would turn him into a tyrant. As the long Monday waned, he told his men to find him a dry house to use that night, and they led him to a white two-story off a road near the rail stop at Big Shanty. It might have been in Ohio, except for the shabbiness. The small barn was already crowded with men. A weedy vegetable garden had a few bean stalks, a few scrawny squash plants. A cow stood morosely under the downpour near an empty chicken run. The oak tree in the yard, a schoolroom chair, was tipped back against the trunk. Would be good for shade if the sun ever came out again. Beyond the back fence, a field of laden cotton stalks slumped under the rain. Several of his soldiers had already spotted a gin house with a tin roof 100 yards or so away, another dry place out of the rain. Sherman gave his horse to his orderly and stepped up onto the porch while the sergeant pounded on the door. An old house slave in a collarless white shirt answered the knock, and behind him came a short, square white man loosening his bib. The Negro stepped aside when he saw the uniforms, but the white man blocked the threshold like Horatius at the bridge. "What do you want, sir?" the man demanded, standing in front of Sherman, irate as a terrier. Sherman pushed him aside and stood inside the house, dripping onto the hardwood floor as his men followed him in. The man's nose wrinkled, and even the slave put a hand to his face. They were a sorry-looking lot, no question. Their boots tracked up the floor with red clay as they crowded in. He wiped his feet on a rug in the foyer and flung the water from his hat. Two more slaves, a boy about Willie's age and a huge woman, hovered with the old one on the far side of the parlor, watching Sherman and his men. Already pacing nervously, a hand in his hair, Sherman thought about the ragged disposition of his army and what they would do when the rain ended. He glimpsed his own lined and weary, sharp-nosed face in a mirror and spun irritably back toward his orderly. "Who's got a dry cigar?" "Who are these people?" the old slave interrupted. "What they want?" "These," said the man, "are the goddamn Yankees." The slave's face lightened. "No, these is?" "Show him out, Private Hayes," Sherman said. Hayes opened a hand to show the owner into the kitchen, but the man spat on the floor, and the Irish sergeant slammed the man's head with the heel of his hand, yanked open the back door, and pushed him out into the downpour, where he lost his footing, missed the stoop, and fell pinwheeling onto his back into the mud as the door slammed. "You better be here when I get back," they heard him shout. "You hear me, Leah?" "How come y'all run off massa?" the old slave asked plaintively when Sherman went back to the parlor. One of the men had come up with a cigar for him, and he lit it from the lamp. "They've come to set us free," the boy said. "You see this man right here?" said one of his men to the boy. "This man right here is General Sherman." The slave stepped back as if a lightning bolt had struck the ground in front of them. "Thy kingdom come," the woman cried. Her body trembled with the fervor of it. Her arms out toward Sherman, she fell suddenly to her knees, and the glasses and plates rattled in a china cabinet across the room. A fine old vase on top of a bookcase tottered dangerously before a soldier caught it, grinned, and dropped it himself. It shattered across the hardwood as the woman swayed and moaned. The Irish sergeant crossed himself. It reminded Sherman of his own timid little Catholic children. "What do you want me to do with these people, General Sherman?" Hayes asked. Sherman put the cigar in his teeth and took off the wet greatcoat to hand to him, shaking out his shirt sleeves. "Hush now," he said sharply to the slaves. "You, what's your name?" "Leah. You hush." The woman's voice dropped away, but she still knelt, swaying, humming. "Here I am, Jesus," she said, reaching forward to touch his muddy feet. "How about you get up and get me some supper, and then show me a dry bed?" "Come now, Uncle Billy, have a bit of joy with us," said the sergeant, wagging a bottle he'd pulled from his jacket. "Take your liquor and your noise somewhere else. I mean it. I'll shoot anybody who wakes me up." The men grumbled and shuffled out onto the porch where he heard them hooting at the owner, who must have been lurking about. Sherman ate the supper intended for the man they had thrown out in the rain. Chicken, black-eyed peas, collard greens, and cornbread. After he finished, the boy made a production of getting Sherman upstairs and showing him all the amenities of the room. "Where do you get these notions about a city of gold?" Sherman asked him roughly. "Mama tells me," said the boy. "Is that old man your daddy?" "No," the boy grinned and shook his head. "How about you leave me that candle?" said Sherman. Alone, for the first time in days, he sat down in a worn armchair to pull off his boots and socks, and then took off his wet uniform and draped it on a hat rack in the inward corner of the room. He dried himself with the towel that Leah had sent up and opened the netting over the bed and lay down naked, pulling the net as tight as he could at the corners. 2 or 3 mosquitoes were already inside it with him. He lay still, sweating, drawing their fire. When they alighted, he flattened them against his skin, one on his stomach, another on the meat of his thigh. Was that all of them? He lay still. After a moment, another one buzzed around his head, and he waited until it sat down on his forehead, and then slapped himself and examined the bloody splay of its body in his palm. The great, steady purpose that kept him riding the lines, checking his men, turning every effort toward the one end of military victory, that had not deserted him. But seeing the boy brought back an old, familiar melancholy. So much depended on him alone. 100,000 men. rail lines stretching back through perilous territory all the way to the bountiful supplies of the north. Nathan Bedford Forrest out there somewhere, a ghost, a demon. That day after Shiloh, Sherman had seen a soldier hold up his rifle to Forrest's body and shoot the man point blank, and the bullet had not even unhorsed him. The shadows of the bedpost angled sharply across the ceiling and the walls. The rain had picked up in intensity. The air was heavy and hot. Maybe he could open the window just a crack and not get wet. He parted the net and pulled up the sash half an inch and lay back down. There was no movement, not even enough to make the candle flicker, though the flame had already drawn a moth that flung its darkness wildly around the room. The corners of the vanity across the room shone in the candlelight, the hand mirror and brushes abandoned there by the owner's late wife. He could smell the owner's sour, salty stink on the pillow, but what was the man's name? There was a Bible on the bedside table. He rolled over and reached through the net for it and found the family register inside and held it up to the candlelight. Josiah Winston McPhee was carefully inscribed next to the date, March 4th, 1844, when he had married Henrietta Patience Sides. Under children's names were listed 7, the 4 born between 1846 and 1854, all with deceased next to them, within the same 2 weeks of October of 1855, when their mother also died. Some disease that took them all. A pang of unaccustomed pity went through him. What, all my pretty chickens in their dam at one fell swoop? He thought of Lincoln repeating the lines to him when they met. Early in the war, shortly after the disaster at Bull Run, he did not remember how Shakespeare had come up. It was before Lincoln's own Willie died, before either of them knew what it was to lose a child. He remembered how he had listened for the children those days in San Francisco when Willie was a year old, the year McPhee's family died. When Ellen left him with the children, he had let her go home, not sorry to see her leave. It had maddened him how peevish she was, so chary of herself. He got mortally sick of it. He had his appetites, and by God, her priests could be eunuchs, but he would do what nature asked of him. She was always thinking of being safely back home with her father in Lancaster. That summer of 1855, she had just left him with all the small children and went back home while he was running a bank in a hard time, back to Thomas Ewing. He closed the book and blew out the candle and lay back down, thinking of McPhee's face in the doorway before the sergeant kicked him out into the rain. Even now, Sherman could hear McPhee out there. The boy had grinned when Sherman asked him if the old man was his father. No, he saw it now. The boy got his light complexion from McPhee himself, from McPhee owning Leah in those lonely days after his wife died. All that big, warm body. An image came back to him from decades before, that girl on Kennesaw Mountain, Lucette, the opposite of Ellen, who ran back to her daddy, who left him with little Willie, who was dead now. Little Willie and the asthma and those smoky rooms, that foggy city, the bank. Willie would be proud of his father, who was forging his immortality from men like McPhee. The proud rebels deserved every desecration. Hardness of heart, the absoluteness of war. The rain fell as though some rip had opened in the old biblical firmament, and here he was in a dry bed for the first time in a month. He could smell the fire to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thanks to all of our readers. Just one remark before we can maybe take a question or two at the end. This series of Wiseblood essays in contemporary culture, which Julia has contributed to, began with The Catholic Writer Today by Dana Joy, which was published about 10 years ago now. And in that essay, he leaves us with this final paragraph that compares the Catholic literary tradition to an abandoned immigrant neighborhood that we must resettle and rehabilitate. And as soon as we begin to do so, we'll look next to us and find that there are other friends joining in this common good. And I just cannot help but note that what we just witnessed in this reading is evidence that that neighborhood has been rehabilitated most definitively. And I give all glory to God for that. And all of our authors, so I just want to say as a sort of public service announcement, will be available, hopefully, to sign their books over the course of the next day or so. Hopefully, even after this very session, they're available over there, as is my novel. You know all that. From Angelico, my novel's from Angelico. But we have just a few minutes to take a couple of questions, so anybody want to ask? Yes?
I'd like to ask Julia a question. I have the privilege of teaching Pride and Prejudice to sophomores, and I'm currently skipping school to do that here. I was wondering if there's an even darker side to Pride and Prejudice, and maybe some other novels of Austen than that. At least in Pride and Prejudice, the telos seems to be off. There's like God isn't really present in the text, and the only time we see Elizabeth Bennet sort of reach some contemplative moment is when she's looking at the portrait of Darcy. And so in that a husband and a wife find their telos, as it were, in each other, that seems to be a sort of unreliable teleology. And so I wonder if there's an even darker side to the absence of God in Pride and Prejudice and other Austen fiction.
Sure. Is this on? Hello? Yeah, I don't think I would put it that strongly. I think the first thing I would say is just simply that Austen was Anglican, and so she didn't really like to talk about God that much. What we do find, I mean, the one novel where I think God is more present is in Persuasion. Not God himself, but Providence is appealed to and invoked several times in that novel, which I think is really interesting because that is a novel that really resists closure, really resists a happy ending. But I think there is there's this very explicit trust in Providence that things aren't necessarily going to go perfectly for us here on Earth, but we're trusting to some larger and less visible design. So that becomes clear in Persuasion, which is her final finished novel. She wrote it, as many know, while she was very sick, and whether she knew it or not, she was dying. And so it has this kind of autumnal sense of like, oh, things are coming to fruition, for good or ill. And I think we can probably read something like that back onto a lot of her fiction, and if we're kind of working out the telos. And in Pride and Prejudice, I don't think God is absent so much as just not being directly contemplated. I simply trust to that. And the word God appears twice in that novel, interestingly. The second time seems less important, but Darcy says it both times. It's interesting. So when he comes on her after she's got this letter saying that Lydia's eloped and destroyed your family, he sees that she's upset, doesn't know what's going on, and he bursts out, "Good God, what's the matter?" And then he calms down because, that was very rude. But he does burst out the word God at a moment when he's suddenly very concerned about this woman he's in love with. And then the previous mention of God was when he's signing off his big letter to her, kind of explaining, well, this is how things have gone in my life, and kind of justifying himself. And he closes it by saying, "I can only add, God bless you," and then he signs his name. And that just seems, and Elizabeth later looks back on that and says, no, the letter was fine. The adieu was charity itself. So that moment, "God bless you," she just says, that's charity itself. So I actually think that God is not fully absent. He's just, there's no beatific vision in the novel, totally agreed. But he is there. It's just a very kind of Anglican kind of reticent way of incorporating him, I think.
So I'm not Italian, but I'm Irish, and there are probably a number of ethnicities that I could invoke to justify going 1 or 2 minutes over time here. German not being one of them, which I also am. But we can take one more question. So I think there was a hand right there. Yes. Yes.
This is also for Julia. Thank you everyone for your great readings. Julia, I was wondering if you had engaged with, just like the previous question mentioned, the idea of God as addressed in the book Jane Austen Anglicanism by Laura Cunningham White, and she addresses the reserve, right, the English reserve that Jane Austen has, but also just like the prayer book soaked life that Austen has, and then just the whole how she's doing her art and such. But yeah, I was wondering if we engage with that, and also the Elizabeth still giving money to Lydia and Wickham at the end of Pride and Prejudice. How should we think of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First, I have not read that book, but I will now go look it up. I would also commend to anyone Jane Austen's prayers. She has all these prayers, these private prayers that she left, which are quite beautiful. Yeah, Elizabeth continuing to give money to the Wickhams is funny. I mean, it's something that I take it Darcy knows she's doing, so I don't think it's subversive or anything. And Darcy continues actually to help Wickham along with buying commissions for him and stuff every time he messes up and gets kicked out of a regiment. But yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because there's a kind of a similar situation which has an opposite resolution in Mansfield Park. So Fanny's cousin Mariah runs off with Henry Crawford, and the family is just shocked, and there's this sense that we cannot reincorporate her. Like, she is dead to us. We can't, and for this reason, they also cannot have any further commerce with the Crawfords. Everything is, so there's no kind of welcoming of the prodigal daughter back, which I think is really interesting, especially for people who like to read Fanny Price as a kind of moral paragon and an exponent of Jane Austen's explicit exponent of her morality. She doesn't react, in my opinion, in a very Christian way to that situation. And then in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins, the clergyman everyone knows is not really a Christian clergyman, he likewise says, oh, you have to cut off Lydia forever. You can't bring her back. You can't reincorporate her. And Mr. Bennet is just going, oh yes, good Christian clergyman. Wonderful way to respond to this. So the fact that, yeah, the Darcys continue to have commerce with the Wickhams, even though there is not, approval of Wickham's character, I think is actually quite consistent with there being, really decent people who are not interested in making these righteous renunciations, but they are interested in drawing certain lines, and I think they probably draw them in the right places.
I just want to, again, say thank you not only to the living patrons of Wiseblood. Many of you in this room have bought our books. We don't take any single purchase for granted. And also just to express gratitude to the people who came before us, not 10 years ago, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, without whose contributions our own living tradition would literally not exist. And I think that it's also especially important to give gratitude to the humble typesetters and copy editors and proofreaders, as well as my deputy editor, Mary Finnegan, who's standing there in the back. If you could just wave, I just want to express gratitude. I think to cultivate a good and rich literary tradition and to kind of defy some of the uglier sides of the literary life, like rivalry and envy, gratitude is an essential corrective. And so thanks be to God, and thank you all.